Episode 17, Little Deer Gets Dizzy. Sharing a bed. Ningxi heard the discussion at the nearby table and felt a bit nervous. Big brother, let's talk properly. How did you figure out that Lu Tingxiao looks at me differently? And the part about looking at my wife's eyes? That gentleman may have poor eyesight, Ningxi coughed and said to Lu Tingxiao. Ningxi had just spoken when the woman at the other table nodded in agreement, you're right. And when you look closely, even though the little boy looks very much like his dad, his eyes are actually quite similar to his mom's, especially when he smiles. Ningxi was close to breaking down. Ahem, the lady over there might have poor eyesight too. Little Treasure couldn't possibly look like her. She wasn't his mother. Lu Tingxiao, on the other hand, discreetly examined the girl's eyes and found that, in fact, they did resemble each other. He had noticed it before, that when Little Treasure smiled, there was a certain similarity in the expression between him and Ningxi. If it was just a coincidence, it was a delightful one. This little incident soon passed. After they were seated, Ningxi sighed comfortably, eating hot pot in an air-conditioned place in the middle of summer is the best. Little Treasure, I promise you'll love this feeling. It had been 2 years since Little Treasure had dined out, so he was a bit curious and looked around. However, he always kept holding Ningxi's hand to feel safe. Ningxi looked through the menu and asked for Lu Tingxiao's opinion. You can't eat spicy food, so should we get a hot pot with a divided base? It's up to you, Lu Tingxiao replied, taking off his coat and casually draping his arm over the back of the chair. It was a simple action, but when he did it, it oozed with charisma. Ningxi felt like a little deer was bumping around in her heart. Recently, for some reason, such situations seemed to happen more and more. It was making the little deer in her heart dizzy. Was Lu Tingxiao doing this intentionally or unintentionally? Their hot pot base and ingredients soon arrived, and Ningxi's appetite was immediately piqued. She forgot about her earlier nervousness and started enjoying the meal. Lu Tingxiao was meticulous even when eating hot pot. He knew exactly which ingredients to put in the pot first, how long to cook each item, and everything was done with precision. He effortlessly served both Ningxi and Little Treasure, just like he did at her place when they had hot pot. Ningxi had never enjoyed hot pot this much before, as everything was cooked perfectly, and she didn't have to worry about overcooking or undercooking any of the ingredients. Are you on the same set as Muyanqing? Lu Tingxiao suddenly asked while eating. Ningxi paused for a moment before she realized that Jiong was a rising young star at Xingshi, and since he was Lu Tingxiao's nephew, it wasn't surprising that Lu Tingxiao would be aware of his current situation. She nodded and replied, yes, he joined the same crew today. I only found out today when I saw him. Is your relationship good? Lu Tingxiao inquired casually. Ningxi scratched her head, thinking that there was no need to hide it. So she answered directly, well, my relationship with him is a bit complicated. We dated for a while, but we broke up a long time ago. Now, we're friends. But I have a feeling that we might end our friendship soon. After he returned to China, he's been causing me all sorts of trouble, almost making me fall into a pit. If he bullies you in the future, tell me, Lu Tingxiao said. Ningxi laughed, haha, that won't happen. In the show, I'm the one who bullies him. And as for real life, well, if he dares to bully me, I'll become his senior sister-in-law and use my seniority to crush him. As soon as she finished speaking, both Ningxi and Lu Tingxiao fell silent. Ningxi wished she could slap herself. How could she not control her mouth? Ningxi desperately served him some dishes. Hee, I was just joking, don't take it seriously. However, Lu Tingxiao seemed unfazed and in a rather good mood. He even smiled faintly and said, not a bad idea. Ningxi was dumbfounded. He actually thought it wasn't a bad idea. Tingxiao. Suddenly, Lu Tingxiao looked at her with a serious expression. Ningxi felt a little nervous under the gaze of his deep eyes. What's the matter? If you change your mind, you can come to me anytime, Lu Tingxiao said. Ningxi's heart skipped a beat when she realized that he was referring to the idea of marrying him. Even though Lu Tingxiao hadn't brought it up again explicitly after her clear refusal, she could always sense the difference in his attitude towards her and the increasingly ambiguous atmosphere between them. Worst of all, her heart was slowly slipping out of her control. Could it be, as Jiong had suggested, that she was being charmed by his looks? After the incident 5 years ago, she had thought she would never love anyone again. For a long time, she had experienced a strong aversion to men, especially when she saw scoundrels. She couldn't suppress the urge to bring them to justice. Although she had become more balanced in recent years, the idea of marrying someone was still far-fetched for her. But now, this man with an expressionless face, an intimidating presence, and the ability to make her feel slightly fearful, had managed to crack open a tiny gap in the thick shell guarding her heart. After finishing the hot pot, on the way back home, Little Treasure got tired from eating and fell asleep in the car. He looked so small and soft that Ningxi couldn't bear to let go of him. Oh dear, this was a disaster. Big Treasure had already caused her enough confusion, and now there was Little Treasure as well. The longer they spent together, the more she liked Little Treasure. She even missed him when they were apart for just a day. If she didn't hold him today, she felt like something was missing. This was not a good sign. Once they arrived home, Ningxi carefully carried Little Treasure into the house. Lu Tingxiao leaned against the door frame, his gaze filled with tenderness. You've taken care of him for the past few days. I appreciate your help. Ningxi tucked Little Treasure in bed and then walked out of the room. It's not a problem. I quite like Little Treasure. After hesitating for a moment, she smiled with a sense of relief and said, Little Treasure is getting better, and it looks like I won't need to stay here much longer. Suddenly, Lu Tingxiao's expression darkened. Do you want to leave? Ningxi took a step back under his intense gaze. Well, I was initially planning to leave once Little Treasure recovered. I've inconvenienced you for quite some time. Lu Tingxiao replied, You haven't inconvenienced us. Ningxi had no choice but to look up at him, her clear eyes meeting his. But I would feel like a burden. Lu Tingxiao frowned. A burden? Yes, Ningxi took a deep breath and continued, to be honest, I'm not a very disciplined person in daily life. If I stay here, I have to be constantly mindful of my actions and behavior. You don't need to be mindful, Lu Tingxiao interrupted her. Ningxi sighed and ran a hand through her hair. Alright, let's say you don't mind that, but I also have a personal life. Occasionally, I may have friends over, and after work, I need some leisure time. I might go cycling, have a drink, or visit nightclubs. And if I happen to meet a handsome guy I like, I might bring him home for the night. Enough. Lu Tingxiao's expression darkened as he couldn't bear to hear more. In the deep of the night, Ningxi lay in her bed with a mind full of turmoil. Why did she even mention bringing a handsome guy home? Every man who had ever tried to flirt with her or have a one-night stand was taken to a dark alley and given a beating. Especially when she saw married men with ring marks, she had a special desire to beat them to their senses. As for her personal life, the sad truth was that she had only experienced it once, and it had happened 5 years ago. Perhaps the initial trauma had been too great, as she still felt disgusted by such matters. Tonight, she had really pushed Lu Tingxiao's buttons, but she had no choice. She needed to address this issue before it spiraled out of control. It seemed better to leave sooner rather than later. If she didn't, one day her ugliest side might be exposed in front of him, and he would leave her without hesitation. Restless thoughts led to a night filled with chaotic dreams. In her half-conscious slumber, various voices echoed in her ears. Ningxi, why do you think you can compete with me? Other than your bloodline, you're a useless piece of trash. Why do you still care about that illegitimate child? What are you planning to do? Are you going to raise him? The child was premature, and I've already taken care of the corpse. Ningxi, let me tell you, from now on, Ning Yaohua and I no longer have a daughter like you. You're no longer related to our Ning family. Little Shi, I'm sorry. Let's break up. I won't abandon you, I'll take care of you like a little sister. She ran desperately, trying to escape these terrifying voices. She reached the rooftop of a hospital, where there was an abyss waiting below, tempting her to take one step further. Finally, she closed her eyes and jumped. However, this time, unlike her usual nightmares, she didn't wake up in fear. Instead, she fell into another dream, a dream that felt almost romantic. She had similar dreams in the past, but they were always accompanied by intense fear and helplessness. This time felt different. One gentle and cool kiss after another landed softly on her forehead, eyes, nose, and lips. She didn't feel the usual disgust or filthiness. Instead, she felt like the most precious and important treasure to the person bestowing those kisses. Who was he? Ouch, why did he bite her? Despite Lu Tingxiao's best efforts to control himself, he had entered her room uncontrollably, and his actions, even though he knew he shouldn't wake her, were becoming aggressive. This woman always drove him crazy. When you happen to meet a handsome guy you like and bring him home for the night, that sentence hit him like a speeding asteroid, shattering his rationality into dust. As his lips and tongue slid down to her delicate neck, the pain in her neck almost made Ningxi scream. However, she could only endure it and awkwardly reminded him, ahem, well, I was just asleep, not dead. You, making so much noise. I can wake up, you know. At first, she thought she could pretend, but in the end, she couldn't bear the pain anymore. It was really hurting. At this moment, Lu Tingxiao's deep eyes had blended with the night. He slowly raised his head, locked his gaze onto her, and used his finger to hold her chin, gently stroking and moving it. His tone was like that of a devil from hell. You're awake, so what? Before she could react, he firmly held her hands above her head and then leaned down, unhesitatingly pressing his lips against hers. Ningxi instinctively tried to break free, but her hands were restrained, and the man's knees pinned down her legs, rendering her completely helpless. What on earth was happening? Could it be that she was still dreaming, and she hadn't actually woken up yet? It wasn't until the air in Ningxi's chest was almost gone, and she was struggling to breathe, that Lu Tingxiao finally temporarily stopped kissing her lips. He moved to the spot on her neck where he had bitten her earlier, and his hot tongue gently slid over the wound, seeming to soothe it, but at the same time, it sent shivers down her spine. Hey, Lu Tingxiao. Lu Tingxiao. Ningxi called out a few times, but there was no response from him. He was completely absorbed in what he was doing. At that moment, when the man was finally still, his heavy and rigid body was pressing down on her, and she was left breathless, struggling to understand what was happening. As Ningxi was overwhelmed with pain, suddenly, all movement stopped, and there was just a heavy, unmoving body on top of her. The suffocating feeling of being submerged in the swamp slowly faded away, leaving her in a daze. Lu Tingxiao? Ningxi tentatively patted the man's shoulder, but there was no reaction. After waiting for more than 10 seconds with still no response from him, Ningxi cautiously and gently turned the man to his side. By the moonlight streaming in from the window, she saw that he was peacefully lying there with his eyes closed, like a sleeping king. It was as if the terrifying beast from just a moment ago had nothing to do with him. This was perplexing. What on earth was going on? Could it be sleepwalking? Ningxi muttered to herself. It seemed that this was the only explanation that made sense. But Lu Tingxiao's way of sleepwalking was quite unusual, wasn't it? Showing up in her room in the middle of the night like a vampire, biting and gnawing at her, and still managing to have a coherent conversation with her? Lu Tingxiao's breathing was calm and steady now, and he appeared to be sleeping. Ningxi didn't dare to wake him up, fearing that he might go berserk again. But leaving him like this was also worrisome. However, in the middle of the night, who could she turn to for help? After considering her options, she thought of one person. She picked up her phone and called Lu Jingli. Hey, little sis she. Wow, you're calling me at this hour. Is something wrong? Is something wrong? Lu Jingli's voice was quite loud, almost shouting. Ningxi had been worried about disturbing him by calling so late, but it seemed that he was quite excited. In the background, there was a noisy and bustling party going on, indicating that he was up all night. Lu Jingli, I have a question for you. Ask away, ask away. Is your brother? What's wrong with my brother? This guy talks and repeats, doesn't he? Ningxi sighed for a moment, then anxiously asked, does your brother have a sleepwalking problem? While Ningxi was on the phone, she didn't notice that the man who had been lying beside her, previously stiff as a board, had tensed up slightly after she asked that question. He had only come up with this idea on the spur of the moment to create an excuse to escape. He had never imagined that Ningxi would call Lu Jingli. If that idiot accidentally let something slip, well, he might as well prepare to have his legs broken. On the other end of the phone, Lu Jingli suddenly fell silent for a few seconds, making Ningxi's heart skip a beat. She urged him, second young master, does he have it or not? If it was just sleepwalking, it shouldn't be a big issue. But if Lu Tingxiao had some other medical condition, she needed to get him to a hospital immediately. It was quite unsettling for a man to suddenly transform into a werewolf in the middle of the night and then suddenly fall into deep sleep, wasn't it? Oh, I was just wondering why you suddenly asked about this. Yes, he does have this condition. How did you know my brother sleepwalks? Lu Jingli replied from the other end of the phone, and his voice sounded normal. Ningxi finally let out a sigh of relief, and she casually said, oh, it's nothing. I was just feeling thirsty and came down for some water. I saw him standing in the living room staring blankly, and it startled me, that's all. Is that so? Lu Jingli's tone was teasing, and then he said in a serious tone, "No problem, it's an old condition. Just leave him be. Whatever he's doing, let him continue, and be sure not to wake him up. He'll return to his room on his own later." Huh? Let him continue, and not wake him up? Alright, I understand. Worried that Lu Jingli might pick up on something, Ningxi quickly hung up the phone. She looked at Lu Tingxiao lying next to her with a headache. Could she really just leave him like this without waking him up? What if he sleepwalked again? It was quite a dilemma. Due to this sudden turn of events, the overwhelming panic that had nearly driven her to the brink had disappeared completely. As she looked at the man who was sleeping soundly beside her, she became more and more annoyed. In the end, she couldn't help but reach out and pinch his face in frustration. "Jerk, you're sleeping so comfortably, while I was almost scared out of my mind." The temporarily insane Lu Tingxiao remained quite obedient. He seemed harmless now, and it took her quite a few pinches to satisfy her frustration. For now, she had no choice but to wait for him to leave on his own. She had heard that waking up someone who was sleepwalking could be extremely traumatic and even fatal. It seemed that she had been the one more scared in this situation. Originally, Ningxi had planned to wait for Lu Tingxiao to leave before going back to sleep. However, she didn't realize that, listening to the regular heartbeat next to her, she would unintentionally fall asleep. Many hours later, the man lying beside her slowly opened his deep black eyes, revealing a complex expression. He absent-mindedly stared at the girl and lightly touched her slightly furrowed brow with his finger. The next morning, Ningxi was awakened by a phone call. Her first instinct was to turn her head and look to the side. As expected, Lu Tingxiao was no longer there. So, she groggily reached for her phone and pressed the answer button. Immediately, she heard an angry voice on the other end of the line. "Ningxi, you've really done it this time. I warned you earlier to be mindful of your behavior and not bring shame to the company. But now, you've managed to embarrass the entire company." Ningxi immediately woke up. "What happened?" Changli said irritably, "Just take a look at your Weibo." Ningxi climbed out of bed and quickly logged into her Weibo account. Then she realized that her Weibo had exploded. Normally, most celebrities' Weibo accounts were managed by their agencies. Of course, Ningxi didn't have that luxury. She hadn't bought followers, and she hadn't been promoted. Her Weibo only had a little over 30,000 followers, and her posts usually garnered less than 100 comments and likes. But now, overnight, there were tens of thousands of mentions and comments. She quickly browsed through the information and finally figured out what had happened.